The train doors clanged open at dusk, and a wave of cold air swept across the platform. From the shadows of the boxcars stepped weary German prisoners of war. Their boots scuffed, their uniforms dulled by months of defeat. They had crossed the Atlantic, and guarded convoys marched through American towns in silence. And now they found themselves at the threshold of a sprawling prisoner camp somewhere in the heart of Texas in late 1943. As they were herded into the barracks, their eyes fell upon the objects stacked neatly on the bunks. Thin light-colored blankets issued by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. The reaction was immediate. Laughter rolled through the room, sharp and mocking, cutting through the fatigue. One prisoner, a tall lieutenant from the Afrika Korps named Franz Mueller, lifted a blanket with 2 fingers as if it were a rag and scoffed. In Europe, even the green recruits would not cover themselves with such flimsy cloth. His comrades echoed the derision. Some slapped the blankets against their legs. Others joked they were fit only for polishing boots to men who had marched in heavy wool across frozen steppes and alpine ridges. This felt like a cruel parody of protection. But behind their sneers lurked an unspoken arrogance. The German army prided itself on discipline, on tradition, on the weight of equipment that symbolized endurance. Heavy blankets meant durability. Light meant weakness. In their eyes, this was confirmation that America's reputation for abundance was shallow, built on cheap substitutes. What none of them realized as they ridiculed the fabric was that these blankets, scorned and dismissed, would soon be their lifeline. Outside the wooden walls of the camp, a cold front swept down from the northern plains, the temperature dropping steadily as night crept closer. The guards handed out the blankets with no ceremony, indifferent to the laughter. For them, it was routine. Another convoy of prisoners. Another distribution of supplies from warehouses that could churn out millions of identical items every month. The moment seemed trivial, almost comedic in its absurdity. Proud soldiers of a fallen Reich mocking what they saw as dollar store rags. Yet, the irony was already set in motion. Within hours, those same blankets would prove their worth in ways the prisoners could never have predicted. The barracks filled with uneasy silence as men settled onto rough wooden bunks. Outside, the prairie winds gathered strength, howling through the cracks in the walls. The laughter lingered faintly, but beneath it, a question began to form, though none dared to speak it yet. Could these flimsy American covers stand against the merciless cold? The stage was set for a revelation that would not only test their bodies, but also their convictions. The first hours of night passed in restless muttering. German officers, still clinging to their pride, compared the thin American issue to the thick woolen blankets of their barracks in Thuringia, Swabia, and the Rhineland. Major Ernst Richter, once quartermaster of a regiment near Stuttgart, boasted in the dim lamplight that our blankets back home weighed nearly 5 kilos each, thick as a shepherd's cloak, and when stacked, they could block the draft from stone walls. His words drew nods of approval. To them, weight meant substance, and substance meant survival. Lieutenant Franz Mueller added with a smirk, "In our camps, a man could wrap himself twice in wool and still feel the bite of January. Here in America, they think a single sheet of thin weave can stand against real winter. This is nothing more than peasant cloth." His comrades chuckled, eager to reassure themselves that their mockery was justified. The German soldier's pride was stitched into tradition, into memories of barracks heated by stoves, bunks layered with heavy bedding, and was so thick it held the smell of smoke for years. But as the oil lamps dimmed and the barracks quieted, their boasts carried a hollow ring. Outside, the wind whistled across the Texas plains, rattling the loose shutters and slamming against the wooden beams. The cold crept in with stealth, a draft that slithered between floorboards and whispered through every crack. Men shifted in their bunks, tugging their blankets higher, though still convinced that dawn would expose the American cloth as laughable. This was more than a debate about fabric beneath the words. It was a clash of identities. The old European faith in heaviness and durability against a new world of lightness and innovation. The The prisoners were certain of their superiority. Wool was tradition, a soldier's heritage. It was to dismiss their own measure of resilience. One anecdote rippled through the room. A sergeant named Wilhelm Becker recalled how during maneuvers on the Eastern Front, his unit had marched with carts piled high with blankets, so heavy the horses strained under their weight. "We froze even then," he muttered, "but at least we had proper wool." The story drew grim laughter, feeding the illusion that suffering underweight proved toughness. None of them yet admitted the obvious, that their mocking words were born from fear. The night was growing colder than they had expected for this strange land and in their hands. The only barrier between their bodies and the winter air was the very cloth they had scorned. By midnight, their pride remained intact, but their comfort was slipping away. The true test was only just beginning. By the time midnight surrendered to the darkest hour, the barracks had transformed into a theater of shivering bodies. The temperature plunged below freezing. An unusual but merciless cold front sweeping down from the northern plains into central Texas. The wind, sharp as a blade, pressed itself against the thin wooden walls, and every gap, every splintered seam, became a channel for icy drafts. Men who had spent the evening laughing now clenched their teeth to stop them from chattering. Breaths rose as white plumes into the dim light, proof that the air itself had hardened around them. The bunks creaked with constant shifting as prisoners tried to curl tighter, drawing the flimsy American blankets close to their skin. What had been dismissed as a joke was now all they had. Lieutenant Franz Mueller pulled the blanket under his chin, muttering curses into the darkness. He could feel the cold pressing against his bones. Yet, something unexpected happened. The blanket trapped his body heat, the weave holding warmth with surprising efficiency. He pressed his palm against the fabric and realized it was warmer than he had believed possible. Beramped, he whispered, too low for others to hear. Across the aisle, Sergeant Wilhelm Becker wrapped himself completely, tucking the edges under his shoulders and feet. He had sworn hours earlier that he would never trust such cheap cloth. But as the wind rattled the barracks door, he clung to it, as if it were the only thing separating him from the grave. In the faint lantern light, his eyes betrayed relief mingled with confusion. A soft groan echoed from the far end of the room. Private Joseph Hartmann, only 20 years old, whispered that he could not feel his fingers. Two fellow prisoners moved closer, pressing their bodies against his, and all three pulled their American-issued blankets tight. Slowly, their breathing steadied. The cloth, thin as it seemed, was doing its quiet work. By dawn, the barracks smelled of damp wood and sweat. But inside, men stirred alive. Not one had frozen to death. Not one had collapsed from exposure. Outside, frost covered the ground like white ash, proof of a night that could have been fatal. The irony had crystallized. Blankets, mocked as worthless, had preserved an entire barracks from a cold. The laughter of the evening had been replaced by silence, heavy and uneasy, as if no one dared to confess what they now understood. What else, they wondered silently, had America hidden in its factories? What other secrets lay behind its strange abundance? The morning sun rose pale and cold, glinting off frost that clung to the camp's wire fences. Inside the barracks, silence hung heavy. Men rubbed their stiff fingers, staring down at the blankets they had spent the night clinging to. The ridicule of the previous evening now tasted bitter. The thin cloth, mocked as useless, had held warmth more faithfully than their thick European wool ever had. It was Captain Walter Mills, the American officer overseeing supply distribution, who offered a quiet explanation to a curious guard. The blankets, he noted, were not wool at all, but woven from synthetic blend perfected in U.S. factories, rayon, and other fibers engineered for lightness and insulation. Unlike heavy wool, these fabrics could be mass-produced by the millions. A single plant in Massachusetts, he added, was producing more than 250,000 blankets every month, while warehouses across the Midwest shipped carloads daily by rail to bases and camps. Such numbers stunned even the guards who passed the gossip along. Before long, it reached German ears. Prisoners who had scoffed began whispering in disbelief. Hundreds of thousands each month muttered. Major Ernst Richter in Germany, even during peacetime, we could never reach such scale. The contrast was brutal. Germany by 1943 was rationing wool, stripping it from civilian coats, and recycling uniforms for the Eastern Front. Yet here in enemy territory, prisoners were covered with blankets that were not only functional, but abundant enough to be handed out to captives. The message was clear. America's strength lay not only in guns and planes, but in factories humming with relentless energy. One prisoner, scribbling secretly in a pocket notebook, later confiscated by guards, wrote that the experience had unsettled him more than any battlefield defeat. If they can afford to clothe their prisoners so well, he noted, what must they be giving to their own soldiers? Anecdotes filtered in like small daggers to German pride. A corporal recalled seeing a train loaded with nothing but crates of blankets, moving west toward another camp. Another overheard guards discussing how American families donated quilts through the Red Cross. Thousands of parcels arriving with clockwork precision to men who came from bombed cities where mothers tore curtains for warmth. This abundance felt otherworldly. The thin blanket was no longer just fabric. It was evidence of industry, of technology, of a society whose strength did not depend on old notions of weight or tradition. The prisoners, once proud of their wool, now faced the realization that innovation could make the fragile stronger than the solid. As the day wore on, many avoided meeting each other's eyes. Pride had been fractured, replaced by a gnawing recognition that the enemy they mocked possessed a power far beyond what they had imagined. The second night came quickly, and with it a sharper edge of cold. No one laughed this time. The prisoners filed into their barracks, each clutching the same thin American blankets they had mocked less than 48 hours earlier. The pride that had fueled their derision was fading, replaced by something quieter, something unspoken. Lieutenant Franz Mueller lay awake, staring at the rafters as the wind moaned through the cracks. At last, he whispered into the darkness, "Without these blankets, half of us would be dead already." His words carried through the room like a confession in church. No one challenged him. Even Major Ernst Richter, who had so proudly compared American cloth to German wool, remained silent. By morning, the camp stirred with reluctant acknowledgement. A few men, warming their hands in the pale sunlight, admitted what they had resisted the day before. "The thing we laughed at," Sergeant Wilhelm Becker muttered, "was the thing that saved us." The irony stung worse than the frost. Their arrogance had cracked under the weight of experience. Some prisoners began to see the blankets not merely as survival tools, but as unsettling proof of American power. Statistics whispered by guards lingered in their minds. One factory alone, producing more than 250,000 blankets each month. Numbers so vast they dwarfed the entire German textile industry. "If they can make this many for us," one soldier muttered, "what are they giving to their armies at the front?" The thought haunted them. It was not just technology, but psychology. To admit that a despised enemy had provided the very cloth that preserved their lives was a bitter pill. Yet survival had stripped them of pretense. They could not deny it. Their pride so firmly built on the myth of German superiority bent under the simplest of objects a blanket, and slowly conversations shifted. Some men argued that this was propaganda, that Americans wanted them to feel grateful. Others countered that no propaganda could change the fact that they had slept and woken alive. The barracks became a place of whispered debate, half-truths, and grudging respect. This realization, simple yet profound, cut deeper than propaganda or defeat on the battlefield. It was a discovery that strength is not always heavy and compassion is not always weak. In the years that followed, many prisoners carried those blankets home. Some stored them in trunks, hidden from view, as if ashamed to admit they owed their lives to an enemy's cloth. Others kept them close, unfolding them in moments of silence, a fragile bridge between the horrors of war and the mercy they had once received.